Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ahmad, and I am the co-president of the Chicago Forum Student Board. It's great to see you all here for what promises to be a timely and important conversation. Today's event, The Case of Palestinian Citizens of Israel, explores how wartime conditions can reshape the boundaries of free expression. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that lead support for the Chicago Forum's Zell speaker and event series comes from the Zell Family Foundation. We're grateful for their support. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. First, we're honored to welcome Dr. Manal Totry-Jubran. She is an associate professor at Bar Ilan University in Israel and currently a visiting professor at the Global Center of Democratic Constitutionalism at University College London. Her work focuses on constitutional law, multiculturalism, and minority rights. She has won numerous awards, including the Segel Prize for exceptional legal articles in Hebrew and the Ma'of Scholarship for outstanding Arab students. Moderating the conversation is Professor Tom Ginsberg. Professor Ginsberg is the faculty director of the Chicago Forum. Before joining the faculty here at the University of Chicago in 2008, he worked extensively with international organizations and governments, including the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal. His scholarship focuses on comparative and international law and has been broadly recognized with awards from the American Society for International Law, the International Society of Constitutional Law, and the American Political Science Association. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to listen. It's really thrilling and exciting to be here. So before I start talking about the title of the presentation, just a few words about my current work. So I'm a constitutional law scholar, but I also do law and society, and I try to kind of connect between the two in order to understand how legal and constitutional regulations, doctrines, and law affect society and how they are implemented by different groups and how they influence and design the concept of democracy and constitutional rights. So in my paper, I try to explore the infringement of the right of freedom of speech and the reconstruction of citizenship in times of war and security crisis through, among others, the counter-terror regulations and laws. And my main argument is that these regulations, specifically in times of crisis, security crisis, kind of reorganize and redesigns the boundaries of political belonging and the political rights of marginalized community through the security narratives. And it kind of reorganizes the way that not only the legal system, but the way that society understands expressions that would normally fall into the scope of protected speech, such as grief, sympathy, political solidarity. These speech are being reframed within times of security crisis as security threats and are being kind of framed as disloyal to the state. And when I talk about freedom, I kind of connect to the saying of Ziad al-Rahbani, who talked a lot about freedom. Ziad al-Rahbani is a Lebanese composer who died a few months ago, and he's the son of Fairuz. If someone knows who's Fairuz, she's one of the important singers in the Arab country. So he says, الحرية مش إنك تحكي، الحرية إنك ما تخاف تحكي. It's not about speaking, but rather it's about not being afraid to speak. So it's not the process of speaking. It's not the fact that I'm standing here and speaking, but the fact that I won't be scared or afraid to speak whatever I want to speak. So in this sense, I'm more interested in the legal practices that enables or limits the rights to freedom of speech beyond this conceptual, normative and theoretical meaning of legal doctrines and constitutional arrangement that protect freedom of speech. And I try to base and develop the current evolving body of work that is called enemy criminal law that talks also about the concept of enemization. So what is enemization? Enemization is framing of individuals and of groups as internal enemies through, and this is a new body of law within criminal law that is being developed in the past 20, 30 years, called enemy criminal law, through counter-terror laws. And well, this new era of law is produced through security discourse and emergency governance. They apply exceptional measures such as surveillance, exclusion, but most importantly, criminalization based on a preventive logic. So usually in criminal law, you will be convicted if you did something wrong and the state proves that you did something wrong. Whereas in the enemy criminal law, you might be indicted and convicted as a preventative harm. So only if, in some cases where it is kind of thought or presumed that you did something wrong, you might be jailed for that. And there's a lot of critical work from the criminal side, which is very important and very interesting, but I'm less interested in this angle, because I'm trying to use criminal law as a tool in order to understand constitutional law. So it's one of the fields of law that can teach us about constitutional rights. So a lot of criticism talk about weakening safeguards and the rule of law. I am trying to understand how the concept of enemization through through enemy criminal law limits or redesigns the right to freedom of speech. Okay, so you probably know all these examples of enemizations in times of security crisis. So it started developing after 9/11, where a lot of emergency regulations in the United States and later on in Europe, as well as the UK, specifically after terror attacks. So there were a lot of emergency regulations and in some cases also enactment of counter-terrorist laws. And I'm trying, and in my presentation, I will focus on the Israeli context and show how in the last 3 years since the war on Gaza, after the events of the 7th of October, how the concept of enemization within the Israeli society has been developed and constructed. So, but what's the problem, or what is common between all these regulations worldwide, is that they have usually very vague definitions of terrorist action or incitement of terror. And these are vague in a sense that there's a very thin line between terrorist action or just demonstration that might be violent but do not have anything to do with terrorists, or incitement of terror, and there's a thin line between incitement to terror and, for example, expressing political speech. So, and it's very important because it's a thin line between enemy criminal law, which have a lot of exceptional and extreme measures, and ordinary law, where the same action could be categorized or as incitement to terror or just disruption of public order. And I'm interested in how we move between these two concepts and how all of these practices or definitions define the right to freedom of speech. Okay, so there's also another critical work that has been developed from the sociological aspects, in the US as well as in the UK concerning the counter-terrorist acts in the UK during the Northern Ireland conflict. And what the most important thing is that well, these critics add the issue of identity politics into the dynamic. And we see that counterterrorism governance often shifts suspicions from individuals to the collective identity. So it's not about whether you did something suspicious or not. It's the fact that you are part of the suspicious community that became suspicious after the attack. And we see that specifically in after terrorist attacks. And what I'm trying to do is kind of combine these two bodies of work in order to understand and to examine how they impact the scope of expression of minorities, how through political discourse, how through legal regulation and directives and so on, how through institutional responses, how all of these kind of limits or redesign the right to freedom of speech of minorities, especially when usually we also encounter asymmetries between on the enforcement of the law of criminal enemy law between groups, which leads or might lead to a chilling effect and self-censorship of marginalized community. And of course, well, I won't have time to talk about it, but marginalized community usually already experience fragmented citizenship, and these dynamics actually reinforces all these feeling of conditional citizenship. Okay, so before I start talking and kind of giving examples on Enemization, just a quick reminder about the context of the 7th of October that happened on a Saturday holiday of Sukkot. 1,200 people were killed, civilians were killed, more than 250 were kidnapped, including men and women. And the Israeli society was in shock and in trauma. I guess some of them are still in shock and trauma. There was a public panic in the Israeli society. And since then, this is how the public sphere looks like in Israel. So you have stickers wherever you go. You have signs wherever you go, stickers on trains, stickers on buses, stickers on throughout public streets. And they say, ביחד ננצח, together we will win. The Israeli flag, of course. עם אחד, לב אחד, עם ישראל חי. The people of Israel is alive. So you already understand that the general environment within the public sphere is together the Israeli Jewish society, together we will win. And it's kind of already a marker when you go down the street who's with us and who's against us. And I will remind you here, I don't know how many people know that, but there were also Palestinian citizens who were killed on the 7th of October, some of them while helping within the Nova people who were trying to escape. And also there were also Palestinians who were kidnapped on the 7th of October. But still the narrative is very much inner Israeli Jewish societal. So when I talk about Enemization, so I will start with the first layer of Enemization in the institutional level within the enforcement system. So regarding protests, there was no change in any regulation or laws that regulate the right to protest, okay? However, in October 2023, a police directive was announced on the 17th of October. So on the 17th of October, Israel still did not invade Gaza, but they were bombing from the air. And on the 17th of October, a residential building with 400 people was hit because the army thought that there would be one Hamas combatant, which turned out to be wrong, but still they bombed the building. So the directive was that there will be a general refusal to permit demonstrations. But what I'm interested here, because I do think that, and then we see it all globally, in times of emergencies, rights can be restricted rightfully and justifiable, that's fine. The problem here is with the narrative that you can see. Deportation to Gaza for sympathizers. 2 days later, the same police spokesman also had an interview radio that was also broadcasted on X. again, emphasizing supporting Gaza is like supporting Nazi terrorist activities, threatening severe precautions. And so the problem here is with the rhetoric and the narrative that was used specifically against sympathizers with Gaza who, at least at this stage, were the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And there's another problem is that protests by the Jewish society were not limited and did occur. So another layer of the state enforcement was the intimidating arrests and humiliation for online posts that were allegedly categorized as incitement to terror. So here we were talking about hundreds of people who were arrested, public figures as well as private figures. In the middle, we're talking about 2 scholars actually that were arrested for a couple of days, and eventually, well, now that is complicated. Some of them stopped even working, or they're in some stage were expelled from the university. But we also see private people who were arrested and humiliated. And what is interesting to see is that all of this was all the time documented and published in social media, so people would understand. If you see here the way that they were also, it's kind of a show trial with their eyes being blocked with the Israeli flag and so on. And then you would say, well, listen, Manal, maybe their posts were indeed inciting, so the arrest and investigation were lawful and legitimate. The problem is, for at least Dalal Abu Amni, so as you can see there, her post was La Ghalib illallah. There's no victor other than God. Barely incitement, but it was regarded as such. And the other thing is, so at least in my recent paper, I did collect posts that were very far from being inciting, or simply having pictures of innocent people in Gaza, of the destruction, of the hunger and so on, the starvation and so on. So this is one point. The other point is there were no arrests, no interrogations, no detentions, no indictments against Jewish citizens to clear inciting posts regarding Gaza. So you see there one of the MK members, Dudi Amsalem from the Likud party. So he says, we don't have any interest to harm innocent people. The thing is, there's no innocent people in Gaza. Okay, it's either you have a son, you have a brother, or you have a nephew. So what we came into this situation that is we are encountering selective enforcement against, among others, solidarity with Gaza. Another level of Enemization is the well, I call it the societal level, okay? So I'll start, so the societal level starts with the academic institutions' response. So a couple of days later, the Minister of Education issued a letter demanding immediate suspension of students and employees supporting terrorism. So again, what is support to terror? Because until now, we could see that support to terror can be just having pictures of innocent people, and that would be framed as supporting terror. Adding to that, also the letter of National Union of Israeli Students and academic institutions themselves that make sure that they made sure that they post endless posts on social media that anyone who is inciting for terror would be expelled and would face hard implications. So I have here some data from Adala, the Arab Center for the Palestinian Rights Minority in Israel. At least in the first month during November, they recorded 250 arrests and interrogations. Students, hundreds of students were all over the country were expelled without due process. The public opinion also, through surveys, we see that the public opinion has shifted. There are more support for censoring Gaza sympathy and decline in commitment to free speech. So people on a social level said, no, free speech should have a kind of a red line, sympathy for Gaza, solidarity with Gaza is where we draw the line. We also saw prosecution in working places, hundreds of people in hospitals, in private clinics who were also suspended and in some cases also expelled. We also saw animosity in social media. I'm finishing in 3 minutes. I'm on time. So I'll give you a couple of examples before I finish. So this is a group in Telegram that started in just a few days after the 7th of October attack. It's called Said Hanatsim, Nazis Hunters. You can see how many members there are there. There are people, private people, who just monitor social media posts, and they post it in Telegram, and in some cases, or most cases, they also give information for the police, who the police have a free hand to open with investigations. The other post is an example of a doctor who used to work in a hospital for 15 years. And this is his profile picture in Facebook that was uploaded in 2021. Okay, so they were also monitoring old posts, not only post 7th of October, but also what people had before that. It's the flag of Saudi, but it's written La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. There's no God except Allah. But you can see down there also the dove of peace. Regardless, he was expelled from his work. We also see harassment campaign for people who were simply arrested and investigated against. For example, this is the example of Dalal Abu Amni, the singer that posted La Ghalib Illallah. So there were demonstrations on a daily basis from 7 o'clock in the evening until midnight, having all these signs. For example, interest is allowed only for people who love Israel, and so on, all with these signs that again not reassure, what's the word? Re-emphasize the borders of belonging. And I'm concluding. Okay, so what I'm trying to present here, how the concept of Enemization have been produced and how it results in social and political exclusion, and how, well, there's a lot of recorded interviews with Palestinian minority that state that they experience surveillance, they are scared to speak up, they are even scared to have likes in social media posts. They feel a sense of erosion of civic belonging. And of course, all of that, when giving the associated cost of voicing dissent, that you might be arrested or investigated, even if you're not indicted at the end. But still, the fact that you can be arrested, Professor Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian from the Hebrew University was arrested for 3 days, and she's I think 63. She was humiliated. She was deprived from her medication. And it's not just being in like a 5-star hotel resort. You are being subjected to very difficult imprisonment. And this, to conclude, this results in general silencing of the Palestinian community. Thank you.
Hold on a second. Technical difficulty.
Good in time?
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming and giving us these insights into the experience of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. I actually want to start out by asking you just a general question about the community, because it's not well known, maybe not even very well known or well understood within Israeli society, much less the United States. So, I understand that it's a majority Muslim community. I guess the question is, for Christians, are you double minoritized? You're obviously the minority within this minority. What's the experience of Christian-Muslim relations within the Palestinian?
So just elementary data. So the Palestinian community in Israel is about 20%. We're 2 million out of 10 million now. This is the recent data. And 80% are Muslims, 10% are Christian, and 10% are Druze, who are kind of very similar to Muslims, to Islam. Well, I don't think that there's a clear answer for that, because In some areas, I think, and I wrote about it, I think that Christians are a minority within a minority in the sense that they are marginalized, but in some senses, although they are in number a minority, they are not marginalized. So for example, in the education system, the private Christian schools are considered to be the best, with the best achievements around the country, even comparing to the Jewish community. And these schools are managed and or controlled even by the Christian community. So they control who teaches there, they control the admission, and so on. So in this sense, they are a minority in number, but I don't think that they are marginalized comparing to the Muslim community. If we look at the academic institutions, for example, so most of the academic institutions, well, again, if we see it in a comparative way, you would expect to have 80% Muslim scholars in the academic institutions, but this is not the case. However, in other fields, for example, in daily life and the crimes that we're witnessing now in the cities and the villages in Israel, I don't know how many of you know, but we're talking about 3-4 people being killed on a daily basis. Okay, so in this sense, I think that, for example, you could categorize the Christian community as minority within minority.
Thank you. And in terms of the general, your topic here, the repression of speech, which of course we've seen in Israel, we see in this country, I tend to sort of think about it in general terms. And as you were speaking about the parallels that we have whenever there's wartime, we're now experiencing repression from the Pentagon and such. Of course, there's a big difference, which is we do have this thing called the First Amendment. And yeah, it's hard, and there's the same chilling effect maybe everywhere. But at the end of the day, we can win a case, as New York Times did just last week against the government. What's the legal framework in Israel for defending against these kind of repressive administrative measures? Right?
Yeah, so I guess for some people here, it was like strange to talk about a regulation of speech, because I know the First Amendment, you can do whatever you want, you can say whatever you want. So in Israel, as well as the UK, by the way, and some European countries, hate speech is unlawful. Okay, so and this is regulated in the ordinary criminal law. And the enemy criminal law, the counter-terror law, incitement for terror is illegal. What protection do we have? So in the 50s, we have a very important doctrine by the Supreme Court stating that one of the main values of the Jewish and democratic state is the value of freedom of speech. Okay, the problem is when in 1992, the most important basic laws, or one of the most important basic laws that were enacted, basic law, human dignity, there's not a word about freedom of speech or freedom of expression, and freedom of religion, by the way. So we have these doctrines that re-emphasize the value and the importance of freedom of speech, but still we don't have it as in basic laws, which our basic laws is kind of the nearest thing to a constitution, unwritten constitution. That some people argue that it is a written constitution, but it's not typical written constitution. So this is the framework.
Yes, and so it's, as you say, there are hate speech laws, and of course, famously, they were applied against Mayor Kahana back in the day,
Yeah.
although it seems like his descendants aren't prosecuted as often, I'm gathering. Is that the case? That we don't, in other words, are the hate speech laws enforced as frequently or as aggressively as the anti-terrorism laws?
Well, first of all, the process of prosecution started since 2021. It's not a new thing. The anti-terror law or the prevention of terror law was enacted in 2016, okay? So before this we kind of lived from one war to another. So before this war, we had the war in Gaza again in 2021, and mostly it was enforced on, again, social media of Palestinian citizens, and nothing was going on in the Jewish society. But it was a little bit of a more complicated situation, because on the last 3 years, we see much more inciting posts from the side of the Jewish community. I would say also that Adala and some organizations already approached the legal advisor of the government and the attorney general with a lot of letters constantly, and showing that there are posts of incitement by the Jewish society that went unprosecuted. So, and I had also an interview with the founder of the cyber office in Israel, and he said that they monitor all posts, all online posts, but still you don't see any posts that are being taken off or persecuted in this sense of the Jewish community.
Yeah.
And regarding Kahana, so in the last, I think, couple of months, we do see some sort of attempts for prosecution of settlers in the West Bank, again, descendants of Kahana, but still it's very, very few. Yeah. It's not, it doesn't cover, I think, 20% of what's happening, of the felonies that is happening in reality.
Yes, that seems to be, obviously there's Gaza, and then the West Bank as separate territories with separate dynamics as what's going on. From here, it looks like there's just active ethnic cleansing in the West Bank with the support of the state. Gaza is its own story. But I guess one question for you is, are there different reactions in Israeli society to those two situations? Within liberal Israeli society, within people who might be inclined to defend Palestinian minority rights?
Yeah, there is. And I have to say that I'm pretty disappointed from my colleagues who for liberal leftist democratic colleagues for almost 3 years were totally silent of what's happening in Gaza, but are very vocal in what's happening in the West Bank, for example, and the attacks of settlers on the Palestinian communities in the West Bank. And it got me puzzled. And because it was very clear for me, and from the first, that there is a process of dehumanization of all Palestinians, whether you're in Gaza and on the West Bank, and probably it will go back, it will also creep in the Israeli society, in the state, coming to us as well. But suddenly, I couldn't understand, how come you are so silent about what's going in Gaza, but you're very vocal and against? So I don't know if it's because we're talking here allegedly of some communities who are doing that, but it has been always been done under the auspice of the state. Mm-hmm. Not in this, I think, not in this huge amounts, but, well, settlers has already been beating Palestinians, burning cities and villages and so on. This is not something new. It is in a larger extent, but still. So yeah, there is differences, and I'm still very puzzled with that, mm-hmm. and annoyed and angry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even J.D. Vance apparently is upset about what's going on in the West Bank, although he denies it. I want to ask you about the boycott movement. Of course, we're the Forum for Free Expression, so I'm just going to put it out there. Maybe we disagree about this. I just oppose academic boycotts. We're all a community of scholars all over the world. We have to support our scholarly colleagues wherever they are. But of course, there are many people in the United States, even academic disciplines, which disagree with my position. How is this perceived, or how are Palestinian citizens of Israel, especially scholars, reacting to this movement? What's the attitude?
Well, I will tell you that 2 months ago, I applied to submit an article to an edited book on critical legal geography, and I got a very critical paper about the displacement in the mixed cities within Israel. So the email that I got was that they are boycotting institutions. So but they are willing to accept my paper, but in some conditions. First, I won't be affiliated with my university. I would be stated as an independent scholar. I wouldn't use, I can't use my institutional email, but I would have to use my Gmail. And another something. So, so my point is, you can see that I would also be harmed from this boycott. So I don't have a clear answer on that, but my problem is, again, the silence that we are witnessing from the academic institutions, the Israeli academic institutions, particularly in the last year. So, and in the first year, I could understand it was a war of defense and so on, but in the past 1 year, 1.5 years, it's completely not a war of defense, but another type of war. And I would at least expect some sort of a stand or some sort of a statement, just a human statement, even not going into legal concepts of war crime and so on, just a humane statement that academic institutions are against the destruction of academic institutions in Gaza, of killing scholars in Gaza, of killing paramedics and doctors in Gaza. So 2 days ago, just going back to the previous questions, 2 days ago, Tel Aviv University had a statement that it opposes the terror attacks in the West Bank. Mm-hmm. So you're opposing what is happening in the West Bank, and you're fine with what's going on with Gaza. Again, it's something that I can't understand. So. Well, boycotting academic institutions will boycott me, and will boycott a lot of people that have very important views that should be heard. But then again, we are in a point of time that I think you should take a clear stand on what's happening, and even it's kind of a neutral, very light stand, but you should take a stand. You should. It's either you're here or there.
I wanted to, this will be my last question, then we'll open it up. But, you know, as I was hearing you talk, I thought, boy, you could find a lot of these things in the United States. We had professors fired in many institutions for saying snide things about Charlie Kirk after he was killed, and even very mild things about Charlie Kirk when he was killed. We've had, in the last decade, actually from both left and right, more professors fired than in the entire McCarthy period. So we're also in our period of great repression of academics. And even more profoundly, I think you really hit it when you were talking about the chilling effect, all the things that are not said, all the ideas that are not developed because of this. I wanted to ask how it looks from your perspective. You travel all around the world, and you've worked in Ireland and Italy, and what do you think of what's going on in the U.S. and what's your, do you have optimism for us? What do you think? How are we going to make it? Are we going to follow down this path?
You have an advantage in this sense, because it's very clear actions that people are going through, and you can kind of challenge it and point specifically on what's happening. Whereas in Israel, and probably elsewhere, what is even more dangerous is that you don't have any clear, for example, people can be discriminated against, people can be silenced in so many indirect ways that you cannot challenge in the courtroom. And you cannot even, or it's very difficult to prove. So for example, I was advised not to deal with all of these things. This is silencing, right? And
advised by your deans, by
a very good friend of mine in my university, from a very good place. Mm-hmm. Like she wanted my benefit, so I won't be harmed in my promotion. So even in the United States, you might encounter all of these procedures that are not direct, that eventually silence people. And I think, like, for example, the issue of promotion, or for example, when I was now in UCL in England. So one of my friends that I met there, he told me, you know, Manal, I want to go out on demonstrations, but I'm afraid because I would kind of be shamed by some of my students. This is also silencing. So there's a lot different level of silencing, and I think that worldwide, and I haven't said anything about social media, for example. So you have the First Amendment, but when Elon Musk acquires X, Twitter, and it becomes X, so, and where do people now express? People express their feelings and their views in social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, or an X. So this is kind of a backdoor regulation in this sense. And this, again, my project is like if you're looking for stains in the ceiling. So if we stick only with constitutional law, so we will look on the source of the stain in the ceiling, but the source can come from the floor and from the walls in this sense, right? So there's a lot of manipulative, illegal, unconstitutional way to make unconstitutional amendments and regulations that in current constitution scholarship are not categorized as unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. So I think that we should all open our eyes more, whether in the American context and in other places, on what does that mean and how these processes are being done.
Well, thank you. I want to open it up in case there's any questions from the floor. And I just ask that you identify yourself. Sir.
Hi, my name is Arthur Hicks. I'm a fourth-year undergrad here. I have a question about context, which is when peaceful religious slogans that to the majority of Muslims mean love and charity are co-opted by terrorists as perhaps implicit or explicit calls to violence. And tell me if my impression is wrong, but I get the sense that happens. Does it present a legitimate challenge to the state of Israel in determining whether people posting those slogans are, in fact, the peaceful with the dove, for instance, or implicit calls to violence? And that's one side of the context. The other side, obviously, is you have repressions of people in the West Bank who are being pushed out of their homes for no security justification, and that has to be considered as well. But how do you consider context? Because in and of itself, the speech might not be a problem, but I wanted to submit it for your consideration.
Should I? So this is a great question, actually, because one of the problems is whether we're talking about the cyber state office. So the cyber state office was established 11 years ago. And what it does, it monitors posts around the world, not only posts of Palestinians, and if there's incitement, so they send takedown requests to social media platforms in order to take them down. The problem is the issue of interpretation, and the problem is that not a lot of people within the cyber office and also in social media. So I'm in my recent work, I work on Meta, for example. And one of the problems worldwide that there are no Arabic-speaking people in Meta that would understand what does this mean, whether it's when we're talking about prayers from the Quran, how could they ever be interpreted as inciting for terror? Obviously, they're being also employed wrongly by different communities and organizations. But one of the problems is on social media and online posts is the issue of interpretation, is the issue. And now we see more and more calls for employing more Arabic speakers, so you can understand the context, the cultural context, the religious context of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, here. Wait for the mic, if you would.
Hello. Hi. Mary Stoner Saunders, alumni, former employee here at the university. My father was born in Jerusalem as an Armenian refugee. So my history goes back to that land. Thank you. I have so many questions around, the freedom of the press and, that element that comes out in the contextual thing of free speech. But I want to pick on the UK for a second. You know, in 2023, I think it was something like 12,000 people were arrested for social media posts. They have labeled Palestinian Action Group, which is people my age who hold signs saying no more genocide, as a terroristic group. At the same time, the incoherence is we have every major organization in humanitarian international aid work, scholars in Israel, Jewish scholars in Israel and beyond, labeling what is occurring in Gaza as genocide. And yet in one of our most robust democracies in the world, a group like Palestinian Action, because of their free speech, is labeled that. Could you just talk about that a little bit and how we reconcile this juxtaposition between experts and people who really deeply know these types of situations, and how, even though they have validated certain interpretations of actions on the ground, when a different person says it, it's considered hate speech?
So Palestine Action, a month ago, the Supreme Court overturned the categorization of Palestine Action as a terrorist organization, and there's an appeal now. So this is another issue that puzzles me, specifically in the UK. So before I spent 2 months in the UK, I was in Italy for 3 months, and you see there very huge difference between the demonstrations in Italy and the demonstration in the UK, for example. You don't hear any arrests in Italy for pro-Palestine or for calling what's happening genocide and so on. And again, I don't have any answers for everything. And I don't know, maybe the historical connection to the mandate. I'm really puzzled with that. But we also see it not only in the UK, we see it also in Germany, we see it also in the Netherlands. And I think that there is kind of a global move, again, under the enemy criminal law, and now the rise of social media worldwide. And because social media recently have been kind of categorized as giving how do you call it, a platform for inciting for terror. So maybe they are enforcing on the extreme side in order not to be perceived as such. And in Israel, yeah, well, I know that I presented a very grim situation, but you're right, you're totally right. There are still work and scholars that call the baby under its real name without being prosecuted, but they might be also persecuted socially. So I have friends, a very dear friend in Tel Aviv University, who was persecuted from day one when he challenged what's happening in Gaza. And I think that you cannot disconnect between the two. When you have this general atmosphere of over-enforcement and labeling people as enemies, it will come back to the society, and society will come back to the law in this sense.
Next question. Yes, over here. And I'll just say one thing about this, which is the United Kingdom Online Expression Act, which they passed, has been a disaster on many, many fronts. And you have people getting arrested for just insulting each other on Twitter and such as well. So the enforcement's, they're trying to deal with this fundamental problem you identified, but in a very clumsy way. Sorry about that.
Well, just one sentence. It's extreme, but it's less extreme than Germany, by the way.
Yes, on this.
Germany's act in 2017 is much more worse in this sense and have an aggressive attack on freedom of speech.
I will refrain from making a German joke. Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Slim Shahada. I work in public policy staff. So hi. My question was, is there a sunset clause that corresponds with the laws that you've identified? Because if not, then it sounds like they're just trying to establish a new, operating procedure. Like, it's permanent. So how can they, is it an emergency, or this is just the status quo from here on out? And then my other question was, you've talked about the selective enforcement being highly racialized, right? There's a highly racialized component that the outcome is that only the Palestinian is capable of presenting a national security threat to the state of Israel, right? And so, but that's not a new phenomenon, right? I mean, the Israeli legal context is, so maybe you could sort of elaborate on the highly racialized nature of the context that's the
Yeah.
paradigm that already exists.
Should I?
Please.
Okay, so in my recent article, I kind of show a historical background of a process of Enemization. It's not something that happened only the last 3 years, but actually from the establishment of the state, the Palestinian minority who were given an Israeli citizenship, contrary, for example, to the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria, who until now have only laissez-passer and don't have any citizenship, even third generation. So we were giving the Israeli citizenship, but we were under a military regime until 1956, which means, like the occupied territories in the West Bank, you needed a permit in order to go and work outside. And if you want to visit family, you needed a permit. So this was the first period after the establishment of the state. And then with every kind of riots or demonstrations against, for example, like next week, yes, on the 30th of March 76, right? It was Yom al-Ard, the Earth Day, if it translated literally. 6 people were killed, were murdered in demonstrations, something that we don't see in the UK, for example, when there's riots. And we're talking about an event that the Palestinian community and the Galil were demonstrating against massive confiscation of land in order to build Jewish cities. Again, we had it again on October 2000, where 11 citizens were again killed, and riots after and when the second Intifada has started. So the Palestinian citizens, since the establishment of the state, were seen by the state as suspicious community. Were defined as Arab Israelis to kind of exclude us or separate us from the Palestinian people, although we are the descendant of the Palestinians that stayed in their land. So you won't see, by the way, in any state reports or offices the word Palestinian citizen. It's Arab Israeli, and this will connect me to your first question. And then when there's emergency or crisis, we're automatically being categorized as Palestinians, as part of the enemy, as part of the other side. And what is interesting here, so they were smarter in this sense than the US regulator, because, well, again, in the framework of counter-terrorism law, there was no newly regulations or laws that were enacted, except the conception of terror, adding a very a small article, but it didn't have any difference on the reality. But what is more dangerous is the directives and the internal policies of ministers and of the Attorney General and of the police, which kind of dictates how these regulations are being implemented. So I will give you something very timely, and I will end my answer. So a couple of days ago, I didn't know that. Well, I kind of guessed, but I didn't know that. So Ben-Gvir, the Minister of Internal, Minister of National Security, he established incitement section within the police. And this incitement section is a bunch of people who monitor online posts. And so it's come to the knowledge of the legal advisor of the government. And he also directed them to find the troublemakers so we can submit an indictment against them and so on. So at least there are some sort of guarantees, theoretically. So the legal advisor of the government issued a letter about the illegality of this new section and that it should be shut down. Of course, he didn't do anything, but this is also another kind of, again, no regulation was changed. It's just an internal way of working that reflects constitutional right of freedom of speech.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Yeah, Ahmad, please.
So I wanted to ask about the intersection of race with the substance of what someone's saying. So you talked a lot about Palestinians who are supportive of Gaza and what they can expect from the state, and you talked about Israeli Jews who may be on the opposite side. But I wonder, and I want to know what you think, or if you've explored this at all, if you're an Israeli Jew who may be similar to a Palestinian against the war, and you're out protesting or you're making social media posts, what happens to you, right? Do you also get prosecuted, or can you expect kind of different standards?
Okay, that's great because so this is a picture of Jewish Israeli demonstrations, and what is happening specifically now in the time of polarized regimes, this Enemization is creeping into the Jewish Israeli society. There are, as you mentioned before, we do have also not only scholars but also a lot of activists standing together and so on, who are against what's happening and who demonstrate and so on. But they're also subjected. So they do demonstrate, but they're subjected to also to police violence, to limitations. For example, there was a case limitation of what kind of signs they could hold. The police banned them from holding signs of Palestinian kids in Gaza. So, well, I'm struggling a little bit in my work in if whether this is the same Enemization or a different Enemization. And one of the even families of the hostages were arrested at some point, and there was also the arrest and investigation of one of the leaders of the demonstrations against the judicial overhaul. He's a soldier in the military. He's a reserved soldier in the military. And the first question that he was asked in his investigation was, "Why do you hate Israel so much?" And so, do I have some? Yeah. So I think that there's broader implications on the process that I'm trying to show, that counter-terror regulation kind of becomes a tool for policing freedom of speech in the UK and worldwide. It's not unique to the Israeli context. And specifically now, we also see it in Hungary, by the way. So specifically now, when we're talking about democratic backlash and so on, this can also creep into dissenters of the regime. And this is something that is really, really troubling, again, worldwide, not only in the Israeli context.
I'm sure there's more questions, but we're out of time. So join me in thanking Manal for joining us.
Thank you.